Here we go.
Nothing, it seems, can fire up Rishi Sunak's campaign. Such is the despair in Tory high command, they sent out the Defence Secretary this morning to push the message, don't let Keir Starmer run away with a giant majority.
You don't want to have somebody receive a supermajority. And in this case, of course, the concern would be that if Keir Starmer were to go into number 10, it will either be Rishi Sunak or Keir Starmer. There's no other outcome to this election. And that power was in some way unchecked. It would be very bad news for people in this country.
You notice this is the Prime Minister? Yeah.
Rishi Sunak insisted in an off-camera briefing that he hadn't given up on winning. Some aren't convinced.
It all suggests, doesn't it, that they're seeing the same numbers we are. The potential for the Conservative Party to just about to cling on to 200 seats at best, maybe plummet way below that.
Yeah, well, and in a way, I mean, to me, that is encouraging that they're not deluding themselves about the situation that they find themselves in. You know, for the last few months, we've had people talking about a narrow path to victory. My view was that narrow path never existed.
The Labour MPs were meanwhile overflowing from the government benches up into the balcony and across the chamber.
In 1997, Tony Blair had more new MPs than all the Tories put together. They struggled to shadow the briefs, were short of funds. The government, dominating select committees, faced less scrutiny. But within Labour, despite warnings from Tony Blair, dissent did flourish.
Realise why you are here. You are here because of the Labour Party, and you owe that loyalty to the Labour Party.
6 months later, and Dennis Skinner and Diane Abbott were amongst scores of rebels on a benefits vote. Many rebellions followed.
The notion is that big majorities, like Tony Blair's in 97, mean that you get very compliant parties and that politics just sort of disappears.
That is completely wrong, totally wrong. Huge majorities are a problem for governments, and a serious problem, and the problem is one of control. I mean, the way control is exercised in Parliament through the whips is preferment. Now, how many posts have you got? You run out, and you're still left with 150 members of Parliament unemployed. What happens is that within the party, your own opposition grows up.
Great to be here at Silverstone. Nowhere better, in fact, to mark the fact that our economy has truly turned a corner. Now,
but today's official growth figure was zero, undermining the positive message he was projecting at the manifesto launch. And insiders think that won't bring the silver lining of an interest rate cut next week to boost Tory fortunes.
I think it's unlikely that they'll cut interest rates at their next meeting, which is in the next week during this campaign. And that's partly because the latest inflation figures were higher than they expected. But it's also, markets don't expect a rate cut. And I think the Bank of England would be reluctant to do anything surprising on interest rates during an election campaign.
It's not unusual to pose with a party leader in your election leaflet, but this isn't hers. Andrea Jenkyns is running to continue serving as a Tory MP. In an omen of arguments to come for the Conservatives, she tweeted, "All Conservatives must be prepared to come together to prevent a socialist supermajority and the end of Britain as we know it."
that's a pothole, more than like it's broken spring. Yeah.
Keir Starmer was promising to spend money on potholes. Tomorrow at his manifesto launch, the focus will be on his bigger promises and how he can hope to improve services and infrastructure without substantial tax rises.
Well, both Labour and the Conservatives are relying on the economy to grow to help them meet their election pledges. So how worried should we be about the zero growth in April? Our economics correspondent, Heliot Ebrahimi, is with me.
Well, as Gary was saying, it's a bad look for a Prime Minister who's talking up economic recovery. If smack bang in the middle of the campaign, growth is revealed to essentially be flatlining. Now, the same rain that was besetting Rishi Sunak on the steps of Downing Street when he called the election was coming down in April showers in one of the wettest Aprils we've seen since 1836, washing out consumer spending and basically putting an end to that run of positive numbers at the beginning of the year that the Prime Minister had been talking about. But Chris, Anyone who comes into the government will need better growth. And this is not a one-month issue, because let's take a look at GDP since the last election. Everything you see above that dotted white line will be better than 2019. Everything below will be worse. And the first line we're going to see come on, that red line that's about to crash out of the graphic completely during the pandemic, that's GDP, only recovers years later and basically chugs along sideways. Tiny bit of growth at the beginning of this year, and then it's flat again in April, as we've circled. The next line you see, that's going to be the hope of the economy, services, done better than we expected. But the problems emerge because this line, that's industry, it includes manufacturing, and as you can see, it's cratering. And those are the kind of fundamental issues, Krish, the next government will have to face.
And is there a magic bullet?
Well, you won't hear this in the manifesto tomorrow, but there has been some chatter about whether a new Labour government might turn to Europe to try and unlock a bit of the economic growth puzzle. Could it be in the form of a veterinary agreement, which would help friction at the border, or perhaps some sort of professional qualification regime for doctors, for lawyers? Or is it likely to be something much more niche that won't end up, Krish, in the front pages of British newspapers, that would help industrial companies, chemical companies, pharma companies? Don't forget that plummeting purple line we just saw, because then you might start to think, well, perhaps a rapprochement with the EU on industrial issues might start for the next government to look more attractive.
Thanks, Helia. Well, one of the other things you might have noticed over the last few days is both Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer trying to be relatable and trying to explain that that they understand ordinary people's pain. Having left D-Day to do an ITV interview, we've seen some of that interview now, and in it, Rishi Sunak talks about the sacrifices he had to make as a child. We've also seen Keir Starmer talking about some of the sacrifices he made as a child. Just listen to these clips.
So like lots of people, there'll be all sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV.
And in a way, my story is testament to this, because it wasn't easy for us. My dad was a toolmaker. He worked in a factory all of his life.
Well, joining me now from Grimsby, where the Sky Leaders event is taking place, is Labour's Shadow Transport Secretary, Louise Haigh. Louise, good evening. And I imagine we'll hear more about Keir Starmer's father, who was a toolmaker, and how he had his telephone bill cut off when he was a kid. I mean, why do politicians feel the need to do this? I mean, don't we just want people who are good at running the country rather than people who are pretending to be like us?
Well, I think politicians answer those questions when they're asked them by journalists. But honestly, I don't think most people mind people's backgrounds as long as they are honest about them and don't pretend to come from a background that they didn't, and don't pretend to be something they're not. But you're absolutely right. This election is about two choices to the country. Do we want 5 more years of chaos after the 14 years we've had of the Tories running down the country and our public services? Or do we want a Labour Party and a Labour government that is prepared to rebuild our public services, grow the economy and put people first again? And Keir Starmer will be making that case tonight. I suppose he draws on his background to say why he makes certain choices in politics, and that explains the choices he would make as a Labour Prime Minister, and I think that's what people are responding to in this election as well.
He talks, doesn't he, about being working class, and you wonder how working class he really was as a kid. You know, he went to a good school. He was a scholarship boy, I get that, you know, but he went to a private school. You know, he went to the Royal School of Music. He became a lawyer. He went to good universities. You know, that's not what most people think of as working class. Is it what you would think of as working class?
Well, his father was a skilled worker, a toolmaker, as you've said. I think that's a pretty solid working class background. And my understanding is that the school he went to only became private whilst he was there, so he didn't attend a private school in the first instance, I don't think. But it's undeniable that he came from fairly ordinary roots and has had an extraordinary career, because he's a very, very talented individual that has consistently shown leadership skills throughout his life. And he's quite a rare candidate for Prime Minister in that he came into politics quite late, having risen up up through the law profession and become the Director of Public Prosecutions, having run a huge organisation that is genuinely quite rare thing in British politics, to have worked so long outside politics and then to come in.
I just wonder whether any of this really matters. You know, I mean, you went to private
leadership
school.
skills.
It doesn't matter, does it?
Well, as I say, I don't think it does matter as long as you're honest about where you came from. I think integrity and honesty matter in politics far more than people's backgrounds. And at the general election, people will be making that choice about two very different options for the next 5 years of this country.
Do you know what's in the manifesto in detail?
Yes, I was there when we agreed it on Friday, but you won't be surprised to know I won't be giving you any hints before it's published tomorrow.
Do you think it's going to make any difference? You know, what a lot of people are wondering is whether this isn't really about detailed plans, because you don't want to do anything that frightens anyone in this election. You're being very cautious.
Well, look, we have set out where we are going to make tax rises already, including the abolition of non-dom, the massive expansion of a windfall tax, that cutting of VAT relief on private school fees in order to invest in our public services. I've set out our plans to radically overhaul public transport, the biggest overhaul of rail in more than a generation, to bring our railways back into public ownership and to expand control over our bus networks. And today we've set out plans to fix our crumbling roads as well. Angela Rayner set out plans to expand workers' rights by the biggest amount in our history, and Ed Miliband on our publicly owned GB Energy. So I completely reject any idea that our manifesto is cautious. It includes major changes that will really impact people's lives. And just because it is fully funded and fully costed, which we make no apology for, because we are still paying the price of Liz Truss's disastrous minibus budget less than 2 years ago, which delivered unfunded, or attempted to deliver unfunded tax cuts for the richest few, that doesn't mean that it isn't radical or they won't deliver real change.
You have talked about bringing the railways under public ownership, which is largely out of necessity, isn't it? But I mean, is that actually going to make the railways run properly at an affordable rate, not plagued by strikes? That's the key.
Well, yes, it's one of the keys, absolutely, and this government have deliberately provoked and prolonged the industrial dispute. We're into the second year of the first national dispute in over 30 years on our railways, and that would be obviously a very early priority of a Labour government to settle that dispute. Our railways are 40% less efficient than some of our European counterparts because of the fragmented and privatised nature of the railways. So not only do we think it is the right thing to make sure that public interest is at the heart of our railways, we're absolutely confident it is the most affordable and efficient way to run a unified publicly owned system as well, just like some of the best performing railways across the world already are.
Louise Haigh, thank you very much indeed. Now, it has just emerged that one of the Prime Minister's closest parliamentary aides is facing an inquiry by the Gambling Commission after apparently placing a £100 bet on when the general election would happen, just days before Mr Sunak announced the date. Craig Williams was Rishi Sunak's parliamentary private secretary and is running for the Conservatives in the July 4th vote. He's admitted putting a flutter on the election, as he puts it, and said he would cooperate with the inquiry. Well, the Conservative Party spokesperson said it's a personal matter for the Conservative candidate and it would not be proper to comment further until any process is concluded. Well, let's speak to the Treasury Minister, Gareth Davis, who is also in Grimsby. Good evening, thanks for joining us. Do you think it's honourable and a thing of integrity for the Prime Minister's closest aide to put a bet on when the election was going to be just before it was announced?
Well, good to be with you, Christian. Thank you for having me. I'm just hearing of this myself. I understand he has made a statement and that there will be an inquiry, or this will be looked into, and that's quite right. If it's true, it's disappointing, obviously, but it's right that he's made a statement, and as I'm just hearing about this, it's quite hard for me to comment further on that.
I mean, it just doesn't strike you as, the highest standards of integrity that Rishi Sunak has been promising?
Like I said, I don't have the details of what happened. I know that that will disappoint you. I understand that, but I am just hearing of this myself, and it's right that he's made a statement which you have read out.
You're there for another sort of TV event tonight, and Mr. Sunak's TV events have not been going brilliantly, in truth. The other one that's out today is this. The quotes are about him talking about his sacrifice as a child, not having Sky TV. Would you regard that as a sacrifice?
Well, look, I think Rishi Sunak was setting out in that interview that, as he said, he's the son of part of a family of immigrants who came to this country with very little, and they instilled in him values of hard work and aspiration. That's what's driving him every single day. He's also somebody that has spoken very clearly that he had a very fortunate upbringing with two parents that worked incredibly hard and inspired him every day. That's why he gets some criticism for mentioning them quite frequently, but that genuinely is what has driven him to become Prime Minister, and the policy agenda that he's setting out for the next Parliament is about aspiration, it's about hard work, and that, as I say, was instilled in him at a young age by his upbringing and the people around him, his family, his parents, and those who came before him.
I mean, I was talking to Louise Haigh about this beforehand, and I just wonder, why it is, somebody who had a privileged upbringing, went to a great school, did incredibly well, is now incredibly rich, feels this need when asked a question like that to sort of imply that he understands what hardship's about. When other politicians, David Cameron, Boris Johnson, his predecessors, have always answered those sorts of questions with, well, yes, I know I was very lucky and that's fine and that's why I want, the best for everybody else. What is the need to sort of feel in touch? Is this a paranoia that you're not in touch?
Honestly, he is somebody that's already said many times that he had a very fortunate upbringing with two parents that worked hard, inspired him, got him the best education they could possibly get him, and, like I said, have driven him into public service as a very talented individual who could frankly do anything, but he is somebody who serves the public every single day. He is somebody, by the way, who is acting on the cost of living crisis that we've just been through.
Well, let's talk about that.
If you look at the action that he's taken...
Let's talk about that, because obviously growth stalled in April, zero growth. You haven't turned the corner, have you?
So it's a completely legitimate question to ask about the data out in April, but what I would say is that, as you know, taking one individual month is always difficult. Looking at longer term periods is a better indication as to what's going on. And as we know, at the start of this year, the first quarter, we are now in growth territory. We are putting in place the policies which will ensure that we have sustainable long-term growth, and all the projections from the OBR, the Bank of England, the IMF are very positive for this country. The IMF predict that we'll grow faster than Germany, France, Italy and Japan over the next few years because of the policies that we're putting in place. So while it's not easy, we've come out of a really difficult period of time with the pandemic and the war in Ukraine and very high inflation, we genuinely have turned a corner now. Inflation is down to 2.3%. We are able to grow our economy because we have a strong labour market, low inflation, and the policies by our government is backing businesses and business investment.
Well, let's see. Gareth Davis, thank you very much indeed for joining us.